On the morning of July 24th, 1915, thousands of passengers boarded the SS Eastland on the Chicago River for a company picnic across the lake. The ship never left the dock. But that story comes later. Chicago is a city that has burned to the ground, rebuilt itself on top of the ashes, and then buried everything it didn't want to remember beneath concrete and steel. What's underneath this city is worse than what's on top of it. And most of the 7 million people living in the metro area walk over it every day without knowing. These are the darkest secrets about Chicago. On the night of October 8, 1871, a fire started on the southwest side of Chicago. The cause has never been confirmed. The cow kicking a lantern story was invented by a journalist and later retracted. What is known is that the city was built almost entirely of wood, including its sidewalks, and that the summer had been unusually dry. The fire burned for 2 days. It destroyed over 17,000 structures, left 100,000 people homeless, and consumed roughly 3.5 square miles. The heat generated its own weather system, creating tornado-strength winds that carried flaming debris across the river. Chicago rebuilt itself in less than 2 years. The rubble from the old city was pushed into Lake Michigan, and today, several blocks of downtown are standing on the compressed remains of the city that burned. During the 1893 World's Fair, a man named H. Holmes operated a building a few miles from the fairgrounds that would later become known as the Murder Castle. Holmes had designed the building himself, hiring and firing construction crews frequently so that no single worker understood the full layout. The building contained rooms with no windows, hallways that led nowhere, staircases that opened onto brick walls, and doors that could only be locked from the outside. Some rooms were fitted with gas lines that could be controlled from Holmes's personal quarters. Guests who checked in, many of them visitors to the World's Fair with no local contacts, sometimes never checked out. Holmes was eventually arrested and confessed to multiple incidents, though the exact number has been debated by historians ever since. Some estimates suggest the building may have been designed to disorient and trap dozens of people over the course of several years. The building was demolished after Holmes's arrest. Today, a post office sits on the site. There is no marker. Now, the Eastland. On that July morning in 1915, the SS Eastland was docked on the Chicago River between Clark and LaSalle Streets. Roughly 2,500 passengers were on board, mostly employees of the Western Electric Company and their families. The ship had a known history of stability problems, but it had passed inspection. As passengers crowded onto the upper decks, the ship began listing. Within minutes, the Eastland rolled completely onto its side while still tied to the dock. 844 people lost their lives, many trapped below deck in 20 feet of water, close enough to shore that bystanders were reaching out, trying to help. It remains the largest loss of life from a single shipwreck on the Great Lakes, and it received far less attention than the Titanic, which occurred 3 years earlier with fewer casualties. A small plaque on the Chicago Riverwalk marks the location. Most Chicagoans walk past it without stopping. The Union stockyards operated on the south side from 1865 to 1971, and at their peak were processing roughly 1 million animals per week. Chicago became the meat capital of the world. The conditions were so extreme that in 1906, Upton Sinclair published a novel called The Jungle, based on what he witnessed there. Workers stood in waste on floors where the pace never slowed, and sanitation was non-existent. Sinclair wrote it to expose labour conditions, but the public fixated on the food safety. The outrage led directly to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Two federal laws exist because of what was happening in one neighbourhood in Chicago. The stockyards closed in 1971, but locals say the smell took years to leave. Beneath the Loop, Chicago's central business district, there are roughly 60 miles of freight tunnels that most people in the city don't know about. They were built in the early 1900s to transport coal, mail, and merchandise between buildings without clogging the streets above. The tunnels are narrow, roughly 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, lined with concrete, and they connect to basements across downtown. They were abandoned in the 1950s when truck delivery became cheaper. The city mostly forgot about them until 1992, when a construction crew accidentally punctured a tunnel wall beneath the Chicago River. The river poured in. Over 250 million gallons of water flooded the tunnel system and rose into the basements of buildings across the loop. The trading floors of the Chicago Board of Trade and the Mercantile Exchange were evacuated. Parts of downtown lost power for weeks. The city had been sitting on top of a massive underground network for decades and didn't remember it was there until the river reminded them. In the summer of 1919, a 17-year-old black teenager named Eugene Williams was swimming in Lake Michigan when he drifted past an unofficial boundary separating a white beach from a black one. He was struck by rocks thrown from the shore and drowned. His death sparked 7 days of widespread racial violence across Chicago's South Side. Homes were set on fire. Families were displaced. Dozens of people lost their lives, and hundreds were injured. The National Guard was called in to restore order. The events of 1919 were part of a larger national pattern of racial violence that summer, which historians later called the Red Summer. The beach where Eugene Williams was swimming is now part of a public park. There is a marker, but it was placed there decades after the fact. Resurrection Mary is the most famous ghost story in Chicago. A young woman in a white dress appears on Archer Avenue on the south side, usually near the Willowbrook Ballroom or the gates of Resurrection Cemetery. She flags down drivers or appears in the backseat of cars, gives directions toward the cemetery, and vanishes when the car arrives. Reports date to the 1930s and have continued for nearly a century. In 1976, a passerby reported seeing a woman inside the cemetery gates, gripping the iron bars. When police arrived, no one was there, but 2 bars had been bent apart with what appeared to be the impressions of a pair of hands pressed into the metal. The bars were removed and examined, but never explained. No one has ever identified who she was. Chicago is a city that has been on fire, underwater, and buried alive. It tore itself down and built itself back on top of what it didn't want to look at. The tunnels are still there. The rubble is still in the lake. The graves are still unmarked. And on certain nights on Archer Avenue, drivers still check their rear-view mirrors. Subscribe if you want to see the darkest secrets about another city explained next. And tell me in the comments which part of Chicago's history disturbed you the most. I'll see you in that video.